welcome everybody. For those who haven't attended any of these sessions, if this is your first time, welcome. If you've been for the last few or the last one or two, we've done two so far, welcome back. My name is Adam Oster. I am the Community Engagement Librarian from the Library of Michigan. And so we're going to be spending a good hour today chit-chatting about how to use Ancestry Library Edition. Which is one of the resources available through both the Library of Michigan and many other libraries throughout the state. Let me switch this over here. And we're also joined this evening by my colleague, partner in crime in these, Matt Pacer, who is one of the reference librarians. So when we have opportunities to ask questions, either at the end, you're more than welcome to ask us. If you do have questions during the session itself, I would recommend just putting it in the chat first, and then we'll try to catch them either in the middle of the presentation itself, or we'll try to make sure to recap them at the end. If you're not already muted, please do so. If there is a point where you feel the need to unmute and ask a question, feel free to do so, but then be sure to mute yourself after that, just so that everybody isn't getting any of the background noises with all of us being at home right now. Okay, so just to give us some background about what the Library of Michigan is and what we do. We always like to talk about this no matter what session we're at. So if you're hearing it for the second or third time, I apologize, but I like to talk a little bit about who we are before we get into the meat of the presentation itself. So we're an institution at the Library of Michigan created by the state to collect, preserve, and provide access to the story of the state of Michigan and to support libraries in their role as essential community anchors. We have been in existence since 1828, initially during Michigan's territorial days, and that we serve state government and the people of Michigan, much like how the Library of Congress does at the federal level. During those territorial days, like I said, we were the territorial library. Once Michigan became a state in 1837, that's when we transitioned to the state library. During those years, as both the territorial and early state library, we were located in Detroit. We moved to Lansing in 1847 when the capital transitioned to the middle of the state. We have existed in a number of different buildings. Up until the 1920s, we were located in the actual Capitol buildings themselves, but then as state government and just the overall population and collections expand, we had to move to a number of other different buildings. In 1983 is when Public Act 54 created the Library of Michigan, where we transitioned from being called the Michigan State Library to the Library of Michigan, less likely to be confused with our good friends down the road at MSU. And then in 1988 is when the Michigan Library and Historical Center opened, which is on Kalamazoo in downtown Lansing, just a couple blocks down from the Capitol. And that is has been our home ever since. We're on the west side, and then on the other side of us is the Archives of Michigan and the Michigan History Center, the State Museum. So we're kind of considered the whole building as the one-stop shop for anything about Michigan history, literature, all that good stuff that tells the story of our state. Just to show a little bit of an interior shot of what we look like, this shows the atrium of the library. We are primarily on floors 2 through 4 for collections, and then administrative staff and library development staff that are up on the 5th floor. Quite a bit of stuff that's in there. Just as far as the collections that we have, Michigan Documents Collection, which includes everything from the early joint documents developed by the legislature and other different entities within the state, annual reports from departments, agencies, and commissions, compiled laws and rules. And then the big collection that a lot of researchers like to utilize is what we sort of commonly call the Michigan Collection, which has everything from newspapers, periodicals, gazetteers and city directories, plats and maps, county and place histories, cemetery transcriptions, other different unpublished materials. We also have the state law library, so we have a law collection, a wide range of different rare books, and this can be everything from early state publications that need to be kept in a more temperature controlled room, other rare items that maybe not necessarily have a direct connection to Michigan, but have somehow been accumulated by the library. The oldest item we have is from 1490, so that really predates Michigan in almost every sort of way, but yet it somehow got collected more earlier on when it was much longer before I ever got there. So I don't know exactly when it did come. So we just have a couple pictures here of some images on the inside of the building. We're always on the lookout for other different things to add to our collections. So if you're ever interested in learning more about that, I would suggest going to the portion of our website, michigan.gov/librarygift. So for anybody who is interested in accessing Ancestry.com through the Library of Michigan's website or the other different databases that we offer, the best starting point is to go to the family history section of our website, michigan.gov/family history. I'm sure many of you, when you were registering for this evening's session, that's where you went to, because we also have the session information about all of our virtual series on there as well. To get access to any of the databases, you have to have a Library of Michigan library card. That is a separate card from your local public library card. It provides access to the databases that we specifically subscribe to, completely separate from your home library or what's available through the Michigan e-library. So anybody who is a Michigan resident can apply for it. You just go to michigan.gov/library-card, and that has the online application for it. Typically takes a few days, sometimes maybe up to a week, to get where we'll send you the card number and PIN number, and then from there you get all the access to the different things that we have listed on the family history section of our website, and a few others that are located if you go to For the Public, which I'll show a little bit later, and then there's another section that includes a few other databases that people have access to. So just to talk a little bit about what is Ancestry Library Edition, I'm sure some people have used it before, but to give some background, it is distributed by ProQuest and powered by Ancestry.com. Ancestry itself is a private entity, and that there is sort of two different versions of it. There is the one that is for private subscriptions. Sometimes it costs between $100 and $200 if you're going to subscribe to it on your own. And then there's the library edition that people can have access to through their local library if they have access to it, or if you're from Michigan, you can get access to it through us at the Library of Michigan. It has billions of different records and census data, vital records, directories, photos, lots of things from all over the place. We're going to review through some of the main documents that are on there. There will be a little bit of overlap with what was talked about during the first session, the Introduction to Family History Research. So there might be some things that you sort of have already gleaned through, but like always, it's always good to review through things multiple times just so that it's further ingrained in your mind as you're doing your research. There's thousands of different individual databases within Ancestry itself, has over 2 billion names. And like I said, it's accessible on site at subscribing libraries, or as what it's transitioned to now, you can get remote access through many libraries out there like us at the Library of Michigan. Let's talk a little bit about some of the popular records that are available on Ancestry. So the big one being the federal census, and sometimes you can also find state census records on there. It was conducted every 10 years since 1790. Right now, 1790 through 1940 census manuscripts are available, and we're just on the cusp that, like, within the next year or two, that we'll have the 1950 ones on there, but we still have to wait until that's released by the National Archives. 1890, you won't find most, if any, of them on there, just because a lot of those were destroyed due to a fire in 1921. There are some random ones that are on there, but just not too many that are available. Census records and data specific to individual respondents are not available to the public until 72 years after a given census is taken. The reason why is that they want people to feel comfortable giving accurate information. So that's why we have to wait until like now that the 1951 is soon to be made available out there. There's a few other different types of census records that exist. The primary one that we most know about is usually referred to as the population statistics or population schedules. So beyond that, we also have the agricultural ones, the mortality, industry. So agriculture is if somebody had a farm, and it shows all the different information about it. Mortality didn't occur every 10 years, but you'll find some of them that exist out there, sort of random different ones during the same year that like the decennial census was taken. And that's typically where they will do a count of everybody who has passed away during that year, give a little bit of an idea of what they died from, where they were living. Industry is going to be more focused on individual businesses, kind of talking about what they're made up of, the types of things that they were selling. And so it's kind of cool, especially if you had somebody who owned one of those small businesses in a small town, whether it was the local A&P or some sort of grocery store, anything like that. It's also good to know that state censuses were conducted between the years of the federal census. Not every state did it, but you'll find a lot of them out there. The Michigan State Census records that are available, not necessarily on Ancestry, but just exist out there, are around 1837, 1845, 54, 64, 74, 84, and 94. And like the little note on here, most Michigan State Census records are not on Ancestry. You will find that there are a few indexes on there, which can be helpful, but then if you are looking for the actual sheets that have the names on them, there's like the Michiganology website has some on there, but often you have to look either on the on the microfilm at either at the Library of Michigan or some of the few other places out there that have it. So let's just look at an example of one of these census manuscripts. This presentation is all with different former state librarians for examples. So we're going to use the state librarian, Mary Frankhauser, who was head of the state library from 1923 to 1933. And so this is what the actual census record in 1930 looks like, and we'll zoom into it in just a second here. But you can see we've got on the top of it, the location, it's in Lansing, the first precinct, where it was located, the Enumeration District. So we can zoom in a little bit here. So we got a fair amount of information that it lists on here. It shows that it has the household members. It looks like we've got her, and I believe by this point her husband had passed away. So it's just her living in this particular household. It also lists her personal information as far as sex, race, age, and marital status, and other education. Shows the locations of her birth and parents' location, and it is kind of cool that you can see where it specifically lists under her occupation, librarian and state library. So at the time in Michigan, there was only one state librarian in the state, and this would be the census record for that individual person. I see there's a question where it says, is there a difference between Ancestry Library and Ancestry you can purchase individually? Yes, there is. So the personal subscription, I don't know the exact number, but I've heard through multiple different people, it's roughly like 3/4 more of the information is on the personal version as opposed to the library edition. The library edition, you're only getting 1/4 of the content. So it's, if you're somebody who you feel is going to be like a really hardcore researcher, especially if you're looking at stuff that maybe is international, it might be worthwhile to investigate to see if it's worth getting a subscription. But if that's not the case, if you're first really starting out, I would take advantage as much as you can of the library edition, because one, it's free in the sense that you're getting it through your library, and then you're not having to shell out, a couple $100 a year in order to take advantage of, in order to get a lot of that content. So, but it is a good question. So just be aware of that as you're deciding if it's something that you want to invest in the future. But my strategy has always been like, do as much as you can with the library editions of it, because there is a lot of great content that you can get on there. You'll find a lot of vital records on Ancestry as well. These come in the form of birth, death, marriage, and divorce. The content between them can vary. Everything from a person's full name, or at least you hope their full name is on there. When somebody's dead and there isn't a family member or friend to sort of give all that information, it can be a little bit devoid of that on there. Birth and death year, birth and death location, spouse and parents' names, gender, burial location, and occupation. When it comes to where these records come from, it varies between states, but with Michigan, it's either the county clerks or the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And that can sometimes make a bit of a difference with what you're looking at on Ancestry, because if you're finding that something seems a little bit off, you might want to see if you can find out if the one that's on Ancestry is either the state version, like what was submitted to the state Department of Health, or if it's the original one that was created at the county level. Sometimes it's really rare, but it is something to just be aware of, because when the original one is written out and they're making the copies, sometimes you can find some slight variations. Very little that happens, but some of the more interesting ways that you do see the difference is that, like, one will be written out and another one may have been typed out. So it's just something to kind of be aware of as you're going along. Many of these also vital record information can also be found through county indexes, and that will be apparent when you're looking at, the older that you get, it's more of an index as opposed to like an actual form itself. Knowing how the transition of vital record requirements, like the law and what was required at different times, is important as you're looking through a lot of this content on Ancestry and just general research itself. I see there's another question here. Can you build a tree on the library edition? You can't build a tree on there. You can view trees that people have created on there, which is a great thing. But if you have created a tree on, like, where you can make one for free using what's considered the personal version of it, you can't directly connect things on there. Those little leaves that come up, that won't come up when you're using the library edition of it. So be aware of that. It's when you're using the library edition and you want to get it onto a tree, you have to download the content to, like, your device and then upload it back up onto where the actual page is that you're got that on. And so that would be the same thing as if you were using some of the other different software and websites for making a tree. If you have other questions as far as, like, what sort of content that we have at the Library of Michigan, if you're not finding something specifically on Ancestry, take a look on the Michigan Vital Records research page that we have on our website, because that we've tried to give a little bit of a breakdown of what it is that we have on microfilm and what it is that you can find on Ancestry, on Family Search, different things like places like that. So let's look at the certificate of death for Mary Spencer. She was state librarian, I believe, from the 1890s up until I think it was 1893 to 1923, so just before her death. And so shows here where she passed away on Sycamore Street, 326 Sycamore, in Lansing. Born in 1842, she was 81 years old. Lists her occupation as a state librarian. Born in Pontiac, has her parents' names listed on there. Burial location in Ypsilanti, and I was able to find a picture of her actual stone right there in Highland Cemetery. Cause of death, chronic senility. And then it also has some contributing factors. Something I like to always point out is if you see those numbers on there, so that 90 that's on there, that's references the International Classification Codes of Diseases. So if you're having a hard time reading text on there, do a Google search for that, and you can find a few pages that exist out there that give the breakdown of what those codes are. It was I'm not sure if they still create that today or use that today, but for many decades, they would put out different versions of that. It would get updated, I don't know, every decade or so. And so you just need to find the one that was the one published just before the person's death of who you're researching. And it's a really cool tool, especially if you find it where it's just really hard, like I said, to read the writing on there. This is what those county indexes look like. So in Michigan, when it comes to vital records, the more modern day version of what we normally see with death records and birth records, that all started in the 1890s, I believe in 1897. And so prior to that in Michigan, it was more these index formats. So this is where we are back at Mary Frankhauser and then her husband, William. They're both buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in Hillsdale. And this is the marriage return for them when they got married in 1900. So we're gonna zoom in here and get to where it actually lists. So we have William Frankhauser, he was 36 years old. Mary Powers was 21 at the time, both living in Hillsdale. He was a lawyer, born originally in Ohio. Can't really see specifically what it lists there for. I want to say it says stenographer. And then their parents, both fathers and mothers listed on there. They were married in Hillsdale itself, and then it lists the witnesses and individual who performed the actual marriage itself on there. So 2 little lines, but a fair amount of information that you can get. And a lot of these have been digitized and made available on Ancestry that you can search for. Newspapers and obituaries. As far as what Ancestry does, they don't have many full text scan newspapers in its collections. However, it does have many index collections that you can find citations for obituaries that you can then use when you're looking for the actual newspapers themselves. So something to keep in mind is that Ancestry now owns, or at least has some sort of relationship with newspapers.com, which is where you're going to find a lot more of those actual scanned versions of newspapers on. And so if you're using the library edition and you have that citation on there, you can't just jump from one to the other. Now we have the library edition of newspapers.com. There are a lot of Michigan newspapers in there, but also like with, when you're trying to access the trees, you can't just jump between them. You have to have one database open in one window and then open up either another tab or another window and then bring up the other the newspapers.com or some of the other ones that exist in or that are out there in order to find the actual newspaper article or obit or whatever it is that you're looking for in the newspaper. So those index collections, that's where we have the newspapers.com obituary index that goes from the 1800s up until present. And then what's another one that's called the U.S. Obituary Collection. So you want to use those citations to either try to look in our newspaper databases, and we've been adding more. I've got some examples on there where we've got Newspaper Archive, newspaper.com, Michigan Chronicle. We also have at the Library of Michigan, Detroit Free Press, Detroit News, and another one that's called Heritage Hub, which has a lot of, it's primarily obituaries, and that one also covers elsewhere in the United States, which you can find a lot on there. And we've got a few more that we're adding. We can't fully announce them yet because not everything has been like completely made, signed off on, but I would keep an eye on our family history page for a few more other ones that are going to be made available quite soon. Okay. See, there's another question about wills. I know there are some probate records that you can find on Ancestry, but I'm not sure as far as wills. Now, if a will was part of a probate record, you might get lucky and find it on there. But I would say you're going to have to dig around a little bit in the card catalog of the database to see if there's anything that relates to wills on there. I personally have not found anything, but granted, it wasn't something that I've really done a lot of looking for. So if anybody does find it, let me know because it'd be really cool to see. Okay. City directories is certainly a big one that a lot of people like to use. So a city directory will contain an alphabetical list of citizens within a municipality. Typically will list the names of the heads of households, their addresses, and occupational information. Sometimes a wife's name will be listed in parentheses or italics following the husband. And sometimes too, where you'll have the wife's name listed and then the husband's name listed after it, and it will say deceased. So there's a couple different circumstances where you'll find two people listed in the same one. But just know that sometimes you can find a couple people listed on there in the same spot. But in most cases, it's just one person. You can also find a business directory, street directory, government directory, listing of town officers, schools, societies, churches, post offices, and other miscellaneous matters of general and local interest. Those are important because, if you've got an ancestor who was attending a church and you want to know where that church was, see if it still exists, find out if records from that church still exist someplace. Definitely a good way to find out where he was at the context of the time where that family member was living in the town. Knowing a bit more about how the local government was set up, because a lot of governments kind of follow the same, standard operating procedures, but it can vary. We don't work with a parish system like what they do in Louisiana or one or two other places. So once you get out of state, if you have ancestors, like I have some that come from a few other places outside of Michigan, and it's good to be aware of that. Okay. Here's an example of what the city directory looks like in 1953, and we're featuring Lolita Fion, who was the state librarian in the 1950s and 1960s. So looking at the 1953 Polk City Directory, and if we just look here right in the middle of the box we have here where it says Mrs. Lolita D. Fion, librarian, state library, resided at 222 Center Lawn in East Lansing. So also be aware if you've got a couple towns that are next to each other, they might fall under the same city directory. So you need to be cognizant of, if a place like Lansing, you've got both Lansing and East Lansing. And someplace if you're getting closer to like Detroit or some of the more, the metro areas that are around the Detroit area or Grand Rapids, that you'll find some that are consolidated into, one volume that covers many municipalities. Draft registration cards. Granted, these only cover a certain time period and a certain select population, but they are on Ancestry and great tools to use when you're doing research. World War I and World War II draft registration cards are on there. Information included on each registration differs between the two wars, but the general information on them that is fairly consistent is going to have like the order and serial numbers that are assigned by the Selective Service System, the person's full name, date and place of birth, race, citizenship, occupation, personal description, and signature. Or in some cases, they might not even have a signature. It could be, you know, if somebody was not well read at the time, that it was the X. And I've seen a few instances of that in other records that I've looked at. So here is the draft registration World War I card that is for Clarence Edward Fion, who was the husband of State Librarian Lolita Fion. So it has on here his name and birth information, his physical description, his occupation. It looks like he was born in Port Huron, works for the engineering department of the Michigan State Telephone Company in Detroit. They were living in Detroit at that time. So before him and Lolita came to Lansing when she became state librarian, previously they lived in Detroit. And I believe at the time she was the Wayne County library director for several years. And then we can jump up to World War II, also for Clarence. And this would be just a few years before that, you know, the 1950s city directory. And it looks like they resided for quite a bit of time at 222 Center Lawn in East Lansing. And then we have on here, instead of, I've always known her as Lolita, and they have on here, it's, I think that's Lolita Fion. I think that's, no, I'm sorry, that wouldn't be her. That would be another family member. So somebody who, it says name and address, a person who will always know your address. So he listed another family member, so I'm guessing that must be a sister or mother. And he was a real estate broker at the time, 5'10", 165 pounds, white, gray eyes, looks like he was gray and balding by that point, light complexion, has a scar on the kneecap, which that's sort of an interesting thing when you're looking at the draft registration, where it has other obvious physical characteristics that will aid in identification. A little just, you know, personal story of how I found it beneficial is that I have one of my great grandfathers, and it listed that he had tattoos on each arm. And I had an opportunity to talk with one of my great uncles, and I asked him, like, hey, what tattoos did your dad have? And he said, how did you know he had tattoos? And I said, well, I had his draft registration card. And he told me that one of them was an eagle and the other one was an anchor, because he was in the Dutch merchant marines before immigrating to the United States around 1913. So little things on there that you can, you know, glean a fair amount of information about just from the front and back of a draft registration card. So let's just talk a little bit about some searching tips, and then we will do a bit more of a live demonstration, walk through how to find the links to it on the library's website, and then actually get into the database itself. Some searching tips, and this might seem simple, but it does make a big difference when it comes to searching for people, and that's the names of individuals, and how their names are spelled can change over the course of their lives. And I'm not just talking about like when somebody gets married, but there are instances that you need to be aware of when looking for somebody. It's important to be cognizant of factors in play at the time the information was recorded, whether it's the language barriers of the person who is giving the information to a record taker, the record recorder not talking with the actual person. I kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier, that it could have been a landlord who was talking to a census taker, or that the spouse or offspring following a person's death just didn't know all the information at the time that the deceased info was given to the county clerk. So it can just sort of vary, and that's when you start having to find different means of searching, whether you try to think of the different name variations. But there are a couple other different means that you can kind of work with that, especially when you're using a database. So this is when you start using these different wildcards. And this is something that also works when you're using, Google or other different more research databases, like the ones that if somebody is, putting together something for a, college course or high school class or something like that. Wildcards can be used to search for names with spelling variations. If you use the question mark, that replaces a single letter in a name. If you use the asterisk symbol, this completes a word with, or name with multiple variations. The one that I always use, I have a great-great-grandfather named Macrillis, and Macrillis just tends to get butchered all over the place. So instead of putting his full name in, I'll put MC and then the asterisk symbol in order to indicate to the database, fill in the rest of his name as you're searching for the records. His last name was Pride, so Pride stays fairly consistent, but Macrillis, apparently nobody in Southern Indiana and Southern Illinois know how to spell that name consistently. Also be aware of place names. Try to be consistent with how you type those locations into the place field on Ancestry. Know that it always goes city or township, and you don't have to put in like the word township after a township name. So like we have Lansing Township here in Lansing, which is next to the city proper. Just put Lansing and then put the county name. So Ingham County, Michigan, and then for country, put United States. If there is the autofill feature working on Ancestry, which is a wonderful tool, once you start typing someplace in, whether it's like Menominee, Michigan, Menominee, once Ancestry recognizes that's going in there, it will fill in the rest. There will be some instances where, some name places has changed. So I used to work in the Grand Rapids area, and for a long time, one of the townships was Paris Township. Well, in the 1960s, Paris Township evolved into Kentwood. So in trying to find those records, I then normally expand it out and just start with the county name and not necessarily putting in the township or city one right away, just to see what pops up. And then if you're trying to narrow it down even further, that's when you start putting in the name of the location of what it was called at the time the record was created, and not necessarily what it is now. So another good tool, just when you're using Ancestry itself, is to browse through the collection catalog. What you do when you're browsing for a book is you use the card catalog and try to narrow things down to specific collections. We typically think when we're using Ancestry that it's like the Google of everything. Well, Ancestry and Google don't necessarily have the same type of search mechanisms within it, and so it can often be better to sort of narrow it down to an individual collection. If you're looking for somebody who's serving in World War I, narrow it down to the different military records and not, search everything. If you're looking for military records, you're not necessarily going to be looking right away for a city directory or census. Stick with one type of topic before expanding out or just move from one to another. So collection focus can be further refined by locations and time period. There is that feature on there as well, that if you want to narrow it down to the 1800s, or if you want to narrow it to a specific decade, like 1850, 1880, something like that. And then another really good tip to think about too is that to periodically check when a collection has been updated. Ancestry is constantly digitizing things or partnering with different groups out there in order to get content. And so you can kind of see when something new has been added. You can see on the database itself, you can sort by date added, and then it will sort it in what was most recently put onto the website, which can be really helpful, especially if you're looking for something new and you want to then narrow it down by a location to see like what from Michigan has been most recently updated or added on Ancestry. And when you're searching in a search results itself, this is where you can use these filter features to refine everything by refining it by collection, whether you want census lists, military records, immigration, photos. There's not a million photos on there, but there are some photos. Excuse me, location, time period, and then language. When you have some of these original records, they're not translated. So if you have those Hamburg lines that are of ancestors that were coming from Germany to the United States, they're in the original German, so you've got to brush up on your Deutsch to be in order to be able to read some of that. And then another good tip too is just with citation information, especially if you need to use this for any sort of documentation, publication, trying to get into some sort of heraldry group. You always want to keep track of all this info. And once you get into the transcribed version of the record, you can see on the bottom where it has the source citation, the source information. So this right here is for, it looks like the World War I draft registration cards, and gives a little bit of description of it. If you need help with some of your creating citations, the Family Search Wiki has a really good Cite Your Sources page that can give you a bit more advice on how to work with that. And then just lastly, a good technique as you're going along, I recommend building a document chronology. This is where you can take all the documents and records that you have for a specific person and make a list of all of them in chronological order. This would be where you have like the year, state, county, city, address, occupation, and document source. So we're going to take a look at Lolita Fion. I put together one of her based on some of the content that I was able to find. So this is where we can follow her from, being born in Iowa in the 1890s, spending some time in Washington, D.C. I think her father spent many years working for the federal government, or at least was in D.C., going back to Iowa, and then eventually moving to Detroit after getting married, living in a few different places in the Detroit area, and then eventually coming to Lansing in the 1950s once she took on the state librarian position. And this is just also cool because it acts like a table of contents for all the records that you have. And you can, I usually make it in Excel, and then as you're going along, you can just add more lines into it and add more stuff to it. Or if you want to just make paper forms and keep adding info to it, it's just a really good tool to have. Okay. Does anybody, before we get into just the demonstration part of tonight's session, does anybody have any questions of what I've talked with so far? Feel free to either put them in the chat, or if you do want to unmute yourself to ask the question, feel free to do so. Or if you want me to bring back up a slide of something that I've already talked about, I can do that too.
I can't figure out how to type it, the chat thing.
Okay.
So I just had a question.
Mm-hmm.
And now I forgot it already.
That train of thought just chewed on out.
Synology. Those directories,
Yeah.
you know how far back they go usually?
I think on the city directories, I know, a lot of those go back pretty far. You're going into like mid 1800s for many of them. I know for Michigan, it goes back, I want to say for Michigan, just of what's on Ancestry, you're talking like the 1850s, 1860s, I believe. So it does go fairly back. Now for other states, it could go back even farther just because they're older, like the New England.
Now I had another question too.
Okay.
One time when I was looking up the maps for like the state at the beginning, it was showing Oakland County all the way up to like Tawas City.
Okay.
So if you were looking for somebody way back then, would that still be Oakland County records, or would that be where they are now? What's considered now?
Unless they somehow got transferred to whatever county was then created out of Oakland County, I would start originally with Oakland, and then if they're not there, then look to see of the subsequent ones that were sort of carved out of that from that locality. There's a really cool tool on the Newberry Library website. Newberry Library is based out of Chicago, and they have this site where it shows the evolution of municipal borders at the county level. So at one point, Michigan was nearly basically all one county. I think it was Wayne County. And then over time, it was being carved out. And
the map I saw showed like 4 counties for the whole state. Like.
So yeah, if you look on that website, it can kind of give you a good idea of everything as you're going along. So
thank you.
You're welcome. Does anybody have any other questions? See, I see there's one question here: how to correct Ancestry things accepted. I would guess that Ancestry probably has a form on there that you can submit content to, or just information to them to say like, hey, I found this page and it has inaccurate information on it. When I get into the database itself, we can look to see if we can find something like that on there and see where it's at. But I would assume, because so much is publicly contributed to Ancestry, especially with those trees, that they have some method in order to do that. Oh, and I see Bruce just put on, yes, you have the opportunity to correct as long as you provide a source. So cool. Okay, well, I think what we're going to do here is I'm going to turn off my PowerPoint in a second and get into the actual website itself. Here. So this is the Library of Michigan's website, michigan.gov/Library of Michigan. And so in order to get to all of our family history databases, if you just click on For the Public, and then go over here to Family History. And we've got a few things on here. We scroll down. Obviously, we've got the stuff here about the Family History Virtual Series and a few things about different family history resources. That vital records that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about death records and all of that, if you want to know more about the vital records that are available at the Library of Michigan, this is the page that has a lot of that on there, where we try to have on what's on microfilm, a bit of a listing of what's on Ancestry, and a few other places in order to get records. Obviously, if all else fails with Michigan, you want to contact the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, just because a lot of that, there should be some form of record that is going on to them if you're not finding it online, or if you're having issues locating it at the county. So if you can't find it at the county, look at the state. If you can't find it with the state, look at the county. And then always be sure to see if we either have it on microfilm or if it's available on Ancestry, some of these other pages. This is where you can get into a few other things too, just finding out more about the different Michigan newspapers that we have at the library. And I see here's a question: is the library available to people outside the U.S.? As far as getting a Library of Michigan library card in order to access the databases, you can't. But as far as contacting us and asking us for reference help, coming in the building once the building itself has reopened, because we're still closed to the public at this point, but we're hopefully sooner than later going to be reopened. That anybody who travels to Lansing to our facility when we're open are more than welcome to come in and use the collections. But then this is where we get to the actual databases. So we have a number of different ones on here, like Beyond Ancestry, the Detroit News, Fold 3, Heritage Hub. Sanborn Maps is something that was relatively newly added. My Heritage, which is provided by Mel, the Michigan E-Library. Several different other ones here. One Canadian one that we added in is this database for the Globe and the Mail, which is based out of from Toronto. And the reason why we added that is that with there being the flow of people, immigrants coming to Michigan through Canada, that you'll find some references to them within that within those newspapers. And I see my colleague Matt just added the URL to the chat of the Newberry Library site. So if you get a chance, you might want to copy that down. Digital.newberry.org is their main page, and then shows how to get to the actual database itself. So we're going to get onto Ancestry Library Edition here, and it will ask you to put in your library card number. And log in. And this is where the main, where we get to the main page. It is a little bit weird where they don't have the search box right away. They used to have that, but now they don't. Just as far as a review of what's up on the top here of different pages that you can go to. If you hit search, that's going to get you to where the search box is to start looking for records by name. Message boards is where people can communicate with one another if they're looking for certain things within individual localities of either the United States and elsewhere in the world. The Learning Center has got some video tutorials and other different things on there. Charts and forms is nice if you want to sort of keep track of everything in the paper form with the family group sheets and pedigree charts, and then looking at see what new collections are out. You can click on that, and that will see some of the more recent additions that the database has made. So we've got a couple questions here. I'm just gonna quick answer. Somebody asking about their library card being a few years old, can it still be used? What I would recommend doing is if you go to, you can either call us and we can look up your card to see if it's still active, or if you go to michigan.gov/library card, fill out the information on there, indicate that it needs to be renewed, because cards only last for, Matt, is it 1 year or 2 years? I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I've done a little bit of that. I want to say it's 2 years. And then
it's 2 years. I put that in the chat.
Okay, cool. And then how to get a card number. If you go on the library's website, go to michigan.gov/library card. That's where the online application is in order to be able to get a card. And it usually takes, like I said, a few days, might take up to a week, just because whenever we do one of these sessions, we usually get a flurry of applications, so it does take a little bit longer to do them. Okay, so we have begin searching here. And we've got a search box. You can either explore by locality. That can feel a little bit overwhelming just because, like for Michigan here, there's 356 collections that focus specifically on Michigan. So you can click on that and go to it, or you can just sort of start with the, I guess I would call it the shotgun approach, because you're just trying to spread everything out as far as you can. I always put in, because he's got a little bit of unique first name, is Harrison Oster, who is my great-grandfather. And we'll just start out by putting in Michigan. And you can see here it then does the auto input for him or for the locality. You can, if you want to, click on these listings of records to narrow it down by different types of records. So I'm going to put in Harrison here. So that we can see here it comes up with, you know, the World War I draft registration card, World War II, his marriage. Let's see. And we've got, he was actually married twice, so there's 2 different marriage records for him. Listing for divorce. Something I will mention about divorce records is, of what I've seen for Michigan, is that you won't necessarily find the actual court case. What you're going to see is the certificate of divorce. And so that will give you like the date of the case of when the judgment was made, but not necessarily like all the evidence and testimony that goes with that, because often, you know, if it's uncontested, which happened with my great-grandmother when her and my great-grandfather got divorced, it was just her there, you know, giving all the testimony. But sometimes you'll get both parties that show up, and then you'll have each giving their arguments. If you're trying to find the actual case, then you either have to go to the court itself, or many of those have been transferred to our neighbors over at the Archives of Michigan. So a fair amount of stuff that you can, you have to use Ancestry as sort of the starting point for then moving on to try to find the actual records itself. You'll also find where other websites have their information indexed on here. So Find a Grave is one. So if I click on that, I'm just going to open it up in a new tab. It has here the the picture that's also on Find a Grave, but then you have to click on the link to get to the actual Find a Grave memorial page itself and the information that's listed on there. So got that right there. And Ancestry, I believe, now owns Find a Grave, but they still, I don't know, for marketing purposes or something, they still have them as completely separate pages. Looking also here on the lower right side, which can be pretty helpful, is you have what's called these suggested records, because this is where it will take the information that you have given in the database search, and it will then spit out other suggested records. So knowing what it knows about what I put in for this particular record, it has it where I can just click on like this one right here, and it's going to bring up the census record for Harrison. And then we've got my great-grandmother Viva when the 2 of them were still alive. And Grandpa Gordy wasn't born yet, but it does have some of his older siblings right there. And then I can click on either source to get that source information. And then I can click on view to see the actual record itself. You can zoom in and out on it. We can also go over here to the side and have a few different things where we can hit save. This send image home, I believe what that does is it sends a link to that through your email, but it doesn't send the actual record. So if you email it to yourself and you're trying to access it from home, remember you got to log back into the database in order to be able to find it. It's better, you know, as far as I'm concerned, to just hit save to this computer, so you're actually saving it to your computer or whatever flash drive or something that you have connected on there. Other different tools that we have, you can rotate it, flip it, invert the colors. So if you're having a hard time reading it, this is where it makes it into black background with white text, which can sometimes be a little bit better to read through. And a few other different settings on here, changing the different types of viewers. I don't really get too much into that, but it is something that's there. The print feature right there. And if I am wanting to narrow some of this content down, like if I wanted to just have the census records, I can just hit census right here, and it then narrows it down to only just the census records. One other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the home page and then click on, let's see here. Just going to click on one of these. I'm going to click on city directories just to show you what it's like if you do click on an individual collection. So it will have often its own search box for that specific collection. You can also browse to narrow it down by individual places or time periods. So I'm just going to hit USA to narrow it down. And then here what it's doing is it's narrowing it down to US city and area directories within the United States. Right now it's sorted by date added. I'm going to do it by record count, just because then this will get me what is specifically that US city directories. So it looks like this one, content does go all the way back to 1822, but remember that will depend on what state locality that you're looking at. So it might not go for Michigan. I don't think it's going to go back to 1822. If you're lucky, that'd be cool, but we weren't exactly settled the most at that time period. But we get in here, and this is where we can search within it. Some feature that I like as well is where you can browse a particular collection, because maybe you don't know, or you want to just browse through the whole volume and not go to a specific name or person. So I can just select Michigan, pick a particular place. Let's do Coldwater, and it will let me, it looks like some of the earliest are the 1880s. Let's do 1882. And then this brings me up to page 1. And I can either, this is kind of a little cool feature on the bottom here where you can bring up a preview of the image and then work your way through, or you can use the little arrows on the side to go back and forth from page to page. So looks like here's where we have the index of the advertisers. And so quite a bit of stuff on there. And like I said, with the Learning Center, this is where there's different sort of research aids, has different maps, gets you into a little bit of background of different type of content on there. I believe Ancestry also probably has its own YouTube page, so you can look on there for video tutorials. The message boards, that's where it's breaking it down, where you can look by particular areas. And this used to be a really big thing where a lot of people, before the internet really got ramped up, that you would put content on, so like you could break things down in the US and look under a specific state and then go to a particular county. County is right here. And if we wanted to look in Chippewa County, which is covering like Sault Ste. Marie, and you can see where it's like it has, this one hasn't been used that much, but you can see the threads that people had in the past. I know my grandmother, when she was still alive, she was using this. You can put in names and see what comes up. Charts and forms, this is where you can, like I said, download these, or you can also have census forms just so that you can see what they look like. So here's a question here. Am I able to add data right to my Ancestry tree or just download and print the documents? You can't add to your own personal tree when you're using the library edition. Unfortunately, it'd be cool if we could, but because, and you'll notice up on the top here, you're logged in as the Library of Michigan and not as your personal account. And as a result, you can't add anything to a tree because you're not signed into it. You're signed into it as the library. So best thing to do is to print, download content, and then when you log into your own tree, or if you're using software, then you can upload it up onto there. So it's little bit of a drawback, but unfortunately, that's just kind of how Ancestry has it set up. Maybe someday we'll hopefully. Okay. I think that's pretty much it. That's kind of the basics of it. Does anybody have any other questions? Or if there's something that you want me to review through, click back on. If you need to unmute, you're more than welcome to do that as well. Okay, so here. I've referred others to my public trees by going to the local library to use Ancestry Library Edition. They have not been able to view my work. Should this work for them? I think so. Let me go to the home here a second, and I'm on it. I'm sorry, I'm already on home. Let's see if I can find where public member trees. So I think this is where if you input information on a person that you're looking for, and then it will bring up the trees. Now I can just see here what happens if I put in Harrison, Oster, and USA, because I know there are some trees that I believe Harrison is listed on. So you can see here whose tree somebody is listed on. So I would say that if there is somebody you're trying to direct people to using the Ancestry Library Edition to see your work, Deb, I would have them search by name of people through this way, and that hopefully will get them to the tree. Now, it could also be that your tree has some sort of privacy setting on it and that it's not showing up, because I see like this is a result for 63,000 trees, and it could be that there's more out there, but they're not made available. So kind of have to play around with it a little bit. Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay. Matt, is there any other ones that I missed that you're seeing in there? Okay, I'm also just going to bring back up our contact information. So if you do have questions in the future between now and the next session, our phone number is 517-335-1477. Email address is librarian@michigan.gov. If you haven't yet applied for a card and you live in Michigan, go to michigan.gov/library card. Access to the library's family history databases can be found by going to michigan.gov/family history, and then just everything that is our entire website, michigan.gov/library of Michigan. One plug I will also throw out for the next session, it's going to be the virtual study hall. So that one will not be recorded or done live on Facebook, just because we're just treating it as more, an informal review session. If there's questions that you come up with between now and then about what we talked about today, we'll do a bit of a brief review, a review of what we talked about this evening. But that's a great time to expand upon that and any other family history topics that you want to talk about. Register at michigan.gov/family history. And with that, thank you for everybody who has attended this evening. And looking forward to the next time that we get a chance to talk. And sometime next week, we will have up on our YouTube page the video for tonight's session. And with that, I think we're done.